The 7 silvers were still missing when the ceiling decided to collect. I had been the lowest line in the firm's own ledger, junior reconciliation clerk, third desk from the boiler, a salaried liability they kept because firing me cost more than feeding me. That was the entry. Disposable. Then the world rebalanced without consulting me, and I woke owning a country. Before that, the desk. Before that, the discrepancy. 400 years of someone else's bookkeeping had crossed my blotter, and every column had closed but one. A deficit of 7 silver against an account no living auditor could name. I had run the trial balance 9 times. 9. The brass lamp ticked as it cooled. The office smelled of cold coffee and the sweet rot of old vellum, and I pressed my thumb to the figure as though pressure could make it confess. 7 silver. Not a rounding error. Errors of rounding apologize and vanish. This one had been load-bearing for 4 centuries, holding up a structure I could not see. I logged the impossibility. I reached to close the cover. The bean came down the way bad debt does, all at once and from above. No pain I could itemize. A white concussion, a sound like a vault door, and then a ledger of a different make opening behind my eyes. 2 columns ruled in light, debit and credit, hanging in air that smelled abruptly of tallow instead of toner. The columns were not mine. They belonged to a body. The body belonged to me now. I inventoried it before I trusted it. Long fingers, soft, ringed, a pulse going too fast at a throat wrapped in unwashed velvet, a mouth that tasted of fever and yesterday's wine. Someone had embroidered a crowned hawk onto the coverlet in gold thread, and 3 of the stitches had pulled loose. I noted that first. Maintenance deferred. Over my own chest, the light resolved into figures, and the figures resolved into a sentence I did not want to read. Prince Aurel, personal liability, accruing, threshold, undisclosed. The credit column held almost nothing, an inheritance of name, a coverlet, a fever. The debit column was patient and very long. Every breath I took added to it by an increment too small to see and too steady to ignore. The way interest is always too small to see until the day it is the only thing in the room. A clerk does not panic. A clerk audits. I sat up. The chamber was stone and damp and grand in the way bankrupt things stay grand for one cruel season after the money goes. Marble underfoot gone gray at the seams, a banner above the cold hearth bearing that same crowned hawk, its lower edge frayed to threads a moth had been collecting for tax. A boy in livery knelt by the door. Over his head the twin columns hung too, faint as breath on glass, and his debit ran toward me. They all would. I understood that before I understood my own name. Loyalty was just a receivable nobody had bothered to factor. The door opened on a steward with a face like a foreclosure notice, and he spoke before he bowed, which told me the realm's manners were already pawned. Highness, the imperial assessor's writ stands. The principality's arrears. He stopped, recalculating whether to wound a sick man with arithmetic. He chose to. Good. 412,000 crowns. Confirmed against the Treasury's own count. I made him repeat the figure. He did. The number did not change, because true numbers never do for you. They only wait. And the term, I said. My voice came out wrong. Younger, expensive, a stranger's instrument I would have to learn to play. 73 days to seizure. His knuckles whitened on the writ. Then the crown, the land, the village, and your person revert to the empire as collateral satisfied. I looked past him at the ledger of light that no one else could see, at the slow climb of my own debit, and at the dying credit column that held one country, one fever, and one fraying hawk. 73 days, 412,000 crowns. The same patient grammar that had eaten the 7 silver 400 years ago. That was when the columns flickered, and a single old line surfaced inside the new account. 7 silver, unresolved, carried forward across 4 centuries into me. The discrepancy had not killed me, it had hired me. The steward waited for me to weep. I disappointed him. Instead, I swung my legs off the bed and set 2 ringed feet on marble, cold enough to bill me for the contact, and the body obeyed, badly, on a delay, like a clerk roused from the wrong shift. The fever had stripped the muscle. I felt the deficit in each thigh, the wasting where appetite had been written off as a loss. I stood anyway. Audit, standing. Words came up my throat that I had never learned. The steward's name, Marin, arrived in my mouth before I reached for it, and with it the grammar of the place, the honorifics, the tax tongue, the difference between a freeholder and a man who merely thought he owned his plow. The dictionary had been loaded while I slept. I tested it. Marin, the treasury's count. Who certified it? The assessor's own factor, Highness. He bowed at last, late, the way a debtor pays. Sealed twice. Sealed twice meant disputed once. I logged that. The chamber surrendered its inventory while he spoke, and I took it whether he offered it or not. One window, leaded, 2 panes cracked and stuffed with wax rag against the wind. A washstand, silver, scratched where someone had pried the gems from the rim and sold them recently, the gouges still bright. A clothes press of black oak worth more than the clothes it held. The banner, the hawk, the moth levying its slow severance tax on the lower hem. Everything here had been grand once, and was now only expensive to keep, which is a different condition, and worse. Then the light came up over Marin. I made myself look. The double entry of souls, I named it on the spot, because a thing you can name, you can file, rendered him in 2 columns hung at his shoulder like breath on a cold pane. His credit ran thin, his debit ran long, and the long part ran toward me, a faint current of ink pulled downhill into the account stamped across my own chest. Loyalty, owed. Service, accruing. The man hated me and would die for me, and both entries posted to the same column. I had read truer balance sheets in bankruptcies. The kneeling boy by the door carried the same architecture. So would the cook, the porter, whatever garrison there was left to feed. Each person a small, failing firm, each owing me by the mere fact of standing beneath my roof. And not one of those receivables yet factored into a number I could spend, assets I could not liquidate. The realm was rich in precisely the wealth that pays no creditor. I read my own columns last, always last. You lie to yourself, longest. Prince Aurel. The debit climbed while I watched it. A tick, another, the increment of simply being alive in a body that cost more than it earned. Breathing was a subscription. Standing here, deciding nothing, bled me. I felt the seep the way you find a slow leak in a roof, by the stain spreading, not the drop falling. Passivity was not free. I had assumed, like every junior clerk, that doing nothing at least did no harm. The ledger corrected me. Doing nothing was a line item. So I would have to act, and acting would bleed me too, and only the correct action, the entry that closed a line instead of opening 3, would buy back a single breath. A brutal accounting. I had spent one whole life inside it, and called it a career. Highness, Marin said, the physician, will be paid from what exactly? Not a question. The body swayed. I braced a hand on the black oak press, and let the wood carry the debt of holding me up. Below the window, a herring gull screamed over the empty market square, hunting scraps where there were no longer scraps, and I understood the bird completely. I straightened, counted the assets again, and got the same insulting sum. One country, mortgaged for 412,000 crowns. One body, failing. One site no other ledger keeper in this world appeared to own. Marin read my face for surrender. He found a balance sheet instead. The term, I said. Once more, with the hour. He swallowed. 73 days, Highness. The writ began at dawn. The sun already stood well past the cracked pane. Day 1, bleeding out while I counted spoons. Over my chest the debit ticked once more, unbidden and posted. 72 days. Falling. Who profits when a prince dies on schedule? I walked into the great hall to take their names. Roll call. They had gathered to watch a corpse keep an appointment. I read it in how wide the doors swung, in the tallow smoke hanging unstirred above heads that turned a half-beat too slow to counterfeit surprise. A doomed man is a closed account. They had booked my death already and come only to initial the entry. Pre-grieved, every one. I gave them an auditor. Steward Kale met me at the dais, hands folded like a man holding a sum he did not want to say aloud. His columns hung at his collar. Credit, respectable. Debit knotted and old, a tangle of arrears that did not run toward me at all, but sideways, off the page, toward someone absent from the room. A receivable always points home. "The Court of Prince Aurel," he announced, and the title cost him nothing because he had already written it off. 40 faces. I stood at the rail and did nothing to test the meter. The debit over my chest climbed. Tick, tick, rent on a silence no one had asked me to keep. So I spoke a word, any word, and it climbed again in a different cadence, the toll on a syllable badly spent. Both directions billed. There was no neutral square on this board, only the long road to ruin and the short. The sick room had whispered it. The hall confirmed it in front of witnesses. Then I found her. Lady Sieglinde stood at the dais edge in gray dyed twice to hide its age, still as a woman who had made stillness a trade. Over her shoulder the columns ran wrong, not hers. A second hand had penned them in neat imperial script, her whole self posted as collateral against a debt that bore my seal on the facing leaf. Betrothed. The tax tongue handed me the true meaning with the courtesy stripped off. Pledged. Security on a loan I had not known I carried. She met my eyes and did not look down. An asset that knew it was an asset. Rare. I worked the room the way you work a witness pool, by who watched the door and who watched the assessor's empty chair. A fat man in marten fur leaned toward my ruin like a creditor at a deathbed, his debit thin, his credit fat with someone else's collapse. 2 captains, unpaid, loyalty accruing interest no treasury could clear. A girl with ink on her knuckles copied the proceedings, and her columns balanced so cleanly I stopped on her. Honest books in a crooked house. I marked her. Someone in this hall would inherit the seizure. The factor's seal named the empire, but empires do not farm bad land, they assign it. Someone here had already won. One of these faces had been promised my dirt, and his credit would carry the print of it, a profit booked before the loss was even mine to lose. "Highness looks well," said Martin Fur, meaning the reverse, meaning he had staked coin on my not standing. "For a man so indebted," I finished, and let the body sway against the rail so the court could enjoy the spectacle. Cheap theater. It bought the half-second I needed to watch his column twitch at the word. Pleasure, posted as credit. He held a wager on my grave, and now I held a line item proving it. I had read 40 failing firms in a single breath and found the realm precisely as solvent as before. Rich in oaths, bankrupt in coin, mortgaged down to the last hawk on the last banner. But the witness pool gave me what the inventory could not, a map of who gained. Sieglinde, pledged, the captains, owed, the scribe, unspent, the marten fur, betting against me with the empire's hand somewhere up his sleeve. A faction is only a column you have learned to read. I had begun to read this one. Cale cleared his throat and unrolled a second writ, fresher than the first, its wax still soft enough to take a thumbprint. "A codicil, Highness," he said, "arrived at noon." The empire had not waited out the term. My debit ticked, a new line opened beneath the old, and the 73 days I had counted as mine were already short by some figure I could not yet read. "The household book," I said, "before the wax cools on that codicil." Cale's hand stopped mid-unroll. A prince at his own viewing calls for wine, or a priest. He does not call for ledgers. The request landed wrong in the hall, the way an honest figure lands in a cooked column, conspicuous by fitting nothing. The ink-knuckled girl moved before anyone gave the order. Across the marble, up the dais, a calfskin tome the size of a paving stone set into my hands, still warm from her satchel. Bound in green, foxed at the corners. I opened it where my thumb fell, which is never where the fraud lives, and read anyway, because a book confesses its honesty in the first line you do not choose. Rents of the lower mill, Michaelmas quarter. The number sat fat and round. Round numbers are confessions. Real money arrives in remainders, in odd pennies, in the limp of a bad harvest. Someone had smoothed this one flat. I walked the row sideways into the carry, into the prior leaf, into the seam where a falsified entry always tucks itself, and found a transfer posted twice and reconciled once, the difference strolling off into a steward's purse 4 quarters running. 40 crowns. Small theft, The column above the scribe's bent head told me she had caught it and lacked the rank to say so. Her books balanced. Her credit carried the freight of every truth she had swallowed to keep her stool. I called for a quill. They brought a goose feather split at the nib, the realm too poor to mend its own pens. I dipped it. I struck the double transfer with one stroke, fin, final, an auditor's line, not a coward's scratch-out, and posted the true figure beneath it in the crooked remainder it should always have worn. 40 crowns restored to a principality that would shed 400,000 in 73 days. Absurd arithmetic. I did it anyway. The line closed. I felt it the way you feel a tooth stop aching, an absence where a small constant had been keeping its time. The debit over my own chest, the one I had watched climb all morning tick by, toll by tick, did not climb. It dropped. One row went dim and settled and paid itself, balanced, dark. Not bled out, closed. The sick room had been half right. Silence billed me. Speech billed me. But a correct entry, the exact and only correct entry, zeroed the cost instead of charging it. Long road, short road, and now a third thing, a way to stop the meter on a single line. I had conquered nothing. I had told the truth in the one place where truth was load-bearing, and the truth had paid me back in kind. Then the book turned its own page. No wind. No window stood open in that hall. The green tome lay flat across my forearms, and the leaf lifted, deliberate, as though a clerk 4 centuries dead had reached up through the binding to set his finger on the spot. The founding account, the principality's first ledger, recopied by every steward since, and there at its root, bearing the whole green weight of the house, sat a deficit. 7 silver, the same orphan 7 I had died chasing. The load-bearing hole in the 400-year-old account no falling beam had ever let me close. It had followed me through the grave and posted itself here, beneath everything, the cracked stone the entire estate was mortared onto. My debit jumped. Not a tick, a leap, digits turning over like a mill wheel with its brakes snapped, the column at my collar spending figures faster than I could read them, fogging and erasing itself the way breath dies on cold glass. The fraud had recognized its auditor across 2 lives and 400 years. It named its price for being seen, and the price was steep. Cale's voice came thin through it. Highness. The codicil. The fresh writ had slipped half from his grip, its soft wax catching the tallow light, and the number inked across its foot finally resolved as my eyes dragged level. Not 73 days. The empire had not subtracted a week or a fortnight. The founding 7 and the imperial seal had been the same hand all along, and the figure that remained to me, posted in that second script, read 9. The sight did not narrow when I closed the green tome. It widened, the way a column widens once you finally see the total it has been quietly building toward. The hall stopped being a hall. Threads everywhere, filament fine, the kind a spider strings a corpse on, running from each bowed neck and clasped hand and sheathed blade, every one of them leaning the same way, every one off the page. I had spent the whole morning reading the wrong book. The true ledger hung in the air above the marble, open since dawn, and the lowest clerk in 2 worlds had never held the rank to see its spine. I held it now. Reversal noted. You read a forgery the honest way. 1 entry, walk to its counterparty, never the whole sheet at once. I picked the thread off Marin's collar. The steward who despised me and would open a vein for me inside the same hour, his loyalty posted in still wet ink, and the line did not terminate at my name. It overran me, past the dais, through the cold seam where the dead prince's banners sagged, out toward a creditor the room had no wall to hold. His devotion was real. It simply belonged to someone else's account. I followed the next, and it bent toward Lady Sieglinde, gray-dyed twice, sitting straight as a tally stick. Her columns were not penned in the household's brown gall. Imperial script, blacker, finer, lettered by a clerk who had never once gone hungry, ran down the length of her soul in a hand I had already met that noon, pledged as collateral against a debt that wore my own seal. She was not a guest. She was security lodged with a pawnbroker, and the pawnbroker carried my face on his note. The pattern resolved the way ledgers do once you stop arguing with them. Every thread assigned a part. The Martin Fur creditor wore the role of mourner investor, his line fat with a wager on my grave. The two unpaid captains stood cast as forfeit in waiting, their wages a credit the thing intended never to settle but to seize. Loyalty, marriage, grief, oath. The hall mistook these for feelings. Each was a line item. The script did not record the realm, it operated it, assigned the roles, routed the rents, walked each soul quarter by quarter toward a scheduled till. A counterparty leaves prints. I traced the threads to their vanishing seam, and they did not vanish. They bundled, the way 100 small debts bundle into one instrument before sale, and the bundle had a holder, the empire. Not a man, not a banner, but a standing order 4 centuries deep, certified by its own factor and sealed twice, that had been skimming this principality's souls into its books the way a mill takes its toll in flour. A little off every sack, never the whole, until the day the whole came due. Here is the one move a forger never budgets for. Edit. If every soul in the hall was a posting could be reclassified, struck, restated, moved to the account where it belonged. The ink-knuckled scribe whose books balanced and whose mouth stayed shut. The 2 captains the empire had already crossed out, the gray woman lodged as surety. Discarded lines, all of them, each carrying credit no one upstream had trouble to claim. The way a discarded fiefdom still holds good ore under its mud. A faction is only a column you decide to total. I began to total. The script felt the pencil move. It self-corrected against the single line I had closed downstairs. The 40-crown fraud restated, and spun a fresh thread to dress the wound before the ink had dried, balancing faster than I could read, repaying my correction with a correction of its own. It audited back. Then the master entry surfaced at the binding of the heir, the oldest posting in the stack, the first contract, 400 years to the season. Every thread in the room hung from it like washing from one rope. At its root, bearing all that weight, sat a deficit of 7 silver in a hand I had chased through one life and a falling beam into this one. The empire's first account and my own were the same account. I was not its newest debtor. I was its oldest open line, and it had spent 4 centuries and 1 reincarnation arranging for me to close myself. 400 years, 7 silver, 1 name on the line, and the name was mine. The appendix unrolled beneath the master entry, the way a factor pins his schedule to the back of a sold note. Ruled, dated, itemized, so the buyer knows his goods before the wax is cooled. A list of collateral, names I had broken bread beside, each valued by the soul, each ruled into a line the empire had priced against the day my account closed. Sir Roderick's oath stood third from the top, his sword hand pledged in advance against my forfeiture. A man cast to die at a door for nothing he would ever be asked to choose. I read down the column, 11 entries. Sieglinda's sat at the head. Her line carried 2 dates. The first marked the morning the contract took her, younger than the court guessed. A girl signed over in imperial black, while another house's grief still steamed on the wax. And the second column stood ruled but empty, an open date waiting to borrow mine. They had not wed a kingdom to a kingdom. They had married a debt to its security, dressed the surety in gray, scheduled the seizure for the season the principal came due. The gap between her dates and my last one came to 9 days. 11 souls posted against me were 11 souls the holder had already written down to nothing. That was the flaw in the instrument. A thing pledged against a default is a thing the lender means to seize and never keep. Dead stock on the books, valued at salvage, watched by no clerk who counts. The 2 unpaid captains. The scribe with the ink-stained knuckles. Roderick's oath. Sieglinda's whole self, each carrying credit the bundle's holder had long stopped bothering to claim, the way a foreclosed mill still turns good water that no one mans. I did not have a kingdom. I had a salvage list, and I meant to restate every line on it. I crossed the marble. The hall read it as a prince walking to his betrothed, and rose to the small theater of the thing, 19 necks inclining on cue, the Martin Fur creditor tilting forward to miss none of it. She watched me come and did not drop her eyes. An asset that knew its own valuation, still as a plumb line, the twice-dyed gray keeping its borrowed color the way a doctored book keeps an old lie. I stopped a pace short. I did not lower my voice for the room. "You were entered before anyone thought to ask you," I said, flat, quiet, the register I had once used reading deficits to men who had already spent the coin. "Imperial hand, a date left open at the foot of your column for the morning I fall." This was never a betrothal. It was a pledge, lodged against my name, held by a house that wears my face on its note. Her gloved hand, folded on her knee, pressed once into the gray and went still. The tallow spat. Something behind her stillness took the figure and set it down. "They called it honor," she said, and her voice did not waver. It counted, each word squared and posted, a clerk's cadence I had not braced to meet in this room. "Died twice to look poorer than I was offered for, lodged in a strange hall, taught the customs of a husband I was scheduled to outlive by a single season. I took the cold in the contract for the cold of the season." She paused. It was a clause. Her eyes moved across the bowed necks, never down, reading the leaning room the way no one had taught her to read it, finding her own thread. The plumb line shivered. She drew the glove off her right hand finger by finger, unhurried, the way you lift a seal you intend to contest, and pressed the bare palm flat to the cold stone of the dais, as though feeling along it for the bolts of the cage. "Then read me the rest," she said. "All of it. If I am the surety, I will know the principle. No tremor in it. A clerk's request, made to a clerk, across a forged sheet hung in the air between two people the Empire had filed on opposite sides of a default. The plumb line had not fallen. It had turned to face the wall it was hung against. Two ledgers reading now where the standing order had budgeted for one, and the holder, who had priced her body, her grief, her open second date down to the last clipped silver, had never once costed her asking me for the sum. I left her question open on the dais and turned to the man no one had thought to count. He stood against the cold pillar where the tallow light gave out, a ledger pressed to his chest, ink gone black in the cracks of his knuckles from a lifetime of posting other men's coin. The court kept a name for him and had mislaid it. I used the one his book kept. "Bring it," I said. He crossed the marble like a debt called early. His thread leaned off page with all the rest, toward the same bundled holder, but it ran thin. The filament of a man priced at the worth of 2 hands and the hours left in them. I did not read the whole sheet. I never do. One entry, walk to its counterparty, the way you test a forged seal by following the wax and not the picture. His wages stood in the left column, 4 years of them, unpaid. The right column called that same sum a loan. The Crown had not failed to pay him. It had booked the failure as his debt, bound his service against it, let the interest dress a free man as a bondsman. A clean trick. I had met its grandfather in a tannery's books once, and died still owed the answer. I took the quill from his own fingers, warm and bitten at the feather, and struck the false loan through. Beneath it, I posted the true figure. Wages owed, by the Crown, to the man. The entry did what correct entries do. His thread shuddered, lifted, came off the page, and stood plumb at his collar like breath steadying on cold glass. Free. The credit the Empire had abandoned settled where it belonged, and the debt it had hung on him went looking for a new place to land. It found me. My own ledger, hung always at the edge of sight, took the transfer the way marble takes a chisel, all at once, with a sound only I could hear. The number at the foot of my debit, the one that was 9 days and 412,000 crowns, and my whole foreclosed self, climbed. Not a little. I had canceled a claim the holder still carried, and the holder does not forgive a balance. It relocates it, patient as a heron reading the shallows. Every silver I lifted off the scribe now sat on me. I logged the jump and did not flinch. Flinching is also a posted line, and I could no longer afford the posting. The scribe turned his freed hand over, studying the palm as though the calluses might read differently now. Then he knelt, not the court's choreography, but lower, the way a man kneels who has decided where the rest of his hours will go. "What do I write now, my lord?" he asked. And it was not flattery, it was a clerk requesting the next entry. I had a second pen in the room and a book that was not the Empire's, A Faction of One. It was more than I had owned an hour before, and it had cost me more than coin could name. That was when the arithmetic bared its teeth. 11 souls on the salvage list, each freed the identical way. False pledge struck, true figure posted, the orphan debt rolling home to my book and walking my number toward the term. I ran the projection cold, the way I ran everything. Roderick's oath would cost more than a scribe's back wages. Sieglinda's whole pledge self, died twice and dated to outlast me by a season, would cost more than both men together. My balance was finite. The days were 9. I could not buy them all and stay solvent long enough to file the final release. So here lay the instrument's last cruelty, the line no clerk had written because none had needed to. I was the only fund that could redeem them, and spending myself was the only currency the redemption accepted. Save one, and the rest slid further off page while I watched. I looked down the leaning hall and counted the threads I meant to cut loose, then counted what each would draw from a man already foreclosed. The scribe was still kneeling, waiting for an order I had not yet priced. 11 names. 1 purse. Closing. 9 days to decide which of them I could afford to let live, and which I would have to enter in my own hand as a loss. The scribe's thread held plumb for the length of one held breath, and then, at the far end of the leaning hall, a filament I had never touched, brightened by exactly the weight I had just lifted off him. I had seen the trick once, not learned it, seen it. When I struck the doubled rent and dropped 40 crowns from my own debit, a fresh thread had spun across the wound before the ink dried, dressing the loss as if no loss had occurred. I let myself believe that was a one-time stitch, a holder's reflex. It was the only thing the holder did. I unfocused the eye the way you do to read a watermark, and the whole script rose at once. Every soul a strand, every strand bent toward the same bundled counterparty, and over all of it a motion so quiet I had filed it as stillness. The ledger was balancing itself. Each line I closed sent a tremor down the sheet, and somewhere a posting I had never opened swelled to absorb the shock. The sum at the foot unchanged, the Empire's total whole. No clerk lifted a quill, no banner moved. The correction welled up from the page itself, patient as rot working a roof beam from the inside. I had been hunting a man, a Martin fur creditor, a steward with his writ, a hand behind the founding 7. There was no man. There was a standing order 4 centuries deep, and the order did not hate me, did not covet my title or the satisfaction of my grave. It wanted balance, the way a level wants its bubble centered. I was a line open against its books. A line stays open until paid or written off, and the order would route around any cut I made, the way water finds the lower board in a tilted floor, finding the slope, finding me. Nothing to bargain with, only arithmetic, never sleeping, totaling in the dark behind the marble. I tested it, because a clerk who will not test his ledger has already cooked it. I struck nothing new. I only watched the scribe, still kneeling, his freed thread bright at the collar, and watched that brightness slide, across some 30 heartbeats, not back onto him, but onto the ink-knuckled girl across the hall, whose own strand thickened by the precise weight of his liberty. The Empire had not lost the man. It had rebuilt his debt to the nearest soul of the same trade, the way a guild moves an apprentice's bond when the master dies in the night. Same column, new name. The figure at the foot did not so much as flicker. So I would stop. Not the work, the method. Every release I posted was a meal the thing digested into someone else's spine, and I had been keeping its books for it, like a junior too vain to ask why the trial balance always reconciled. It reconciled because it was built to. A self-correcting ledger forgives nothing and questions nothing. It only moves the figure to the account that fits the shape of the whole. There was the seam. It would accept any entry that balanced, because it could not read intent, only sums, and a mechanism that must always reconcile must always swallow whatever closes to 0, even a reclassification penned in its own founding hand. I lifted my head off the salvage list. The system wanted me there, eyes down, pricing 11 names against one closing purse until the term came and ate the accountant whole. Wrong question. I would not free them one at a time into its waiting mouth, and I would not let the girl carry a man's bond she had never signed. I would gather the struck and the discarded, the scribe, the girl, every soul this engine had written off as too small to chase, and retotal them into a single account the empire had never thought to track, an unclaimed credit walking on its own legs. A faction with a balance. Not the souls then, the counterparty. I walked my eye up the leaning threads the honest way, one posting at a time, toward the master entry sealed by one hand twice, 400 years cold. The only account vast enough to hold the loss I meant to book. I dipped the scribe's bitten quill. I would not pay the order. I would restate it. 3 candle ends. That was the whole of it. Ignition to ash. By the first puddle of tallow, I had settled the falsified debts, and settling is not the same as paying. I matched them. Every loan that had never crossed a table, every cartload of grain delivered only on parchment, every soldier's wage logged as disbursed and then disbursed again into the same waiting cuff. I found the phantom credit, found its phantom debit, and set the two against each other until they canceled like struck flints. No spark, no smoke, only a hole in the air where a fraud had stood upright for years. The ink-knuckled girl watched the third one go dark, and her quill quit her hand. Then the phantom accounts, which are subtler, because a lie that balances will sit quiet in a ledger for a lifetime. I walk the columns the slow way, reading not the figures but the gaps between them, the places where a sum was too round, a transfer too clean, a tithe that arrived on the same day each quarter, regardless of harvest or plague. Rounded numbers are confessions. Honest money is filthy with odd pence. I reconciled what had been built never to reconcile, and as each false account folded inward, the thread that had fed it whipped loose across the hall and hung unowned, waiting for an owner. I let them wait. I had a place to put them. Kale came last. The largest theft is always the one nearest the seal. His sole column stood as he had always presented them, respectable credit, a steward's tidy obedience, the bearing of a man who had buried more princes than he had served. Under it ran the rot. One old debit, knotted, doubling back on itself, sliding sideways off the right edge of the page toward a name that had never once stood in this hall. A receivable that pointed, not at the crown, but homeward, to a strongbox beneath a floor in a village he thought too small to be counted. I counted it. Decade by decade, I unstacked the toll he had taken. A mill takes flour, and Kale had taken souls. A thin skim off every estate he managed, never enough in 1 year to flag, ruinous across 40. He had written me off as a closed account the moment he named me prince at the dais. He had not thought the closed account would open him. I did not denounce him. Denunciation is for men who want applause. I posted the restatement plainly into the air above his head, every skimmed fraction restored to its proper line before a court that could not yet read the columns, but could read his face going the color of cold ash. His sideways debit straightened. The receivable pointing home swung round and pointed at him. 40 years of toll retotaled in a single sweep, and the figure that surfaced at the foot of his column was larger than the rent they had condemned me to pay. The candle guttered. Kale's mouth opened on a defense and found no ledger to stand on. What surfaced from all of it, the canceled frauds, the freed threads, the toll restored, did not scatter. I gathered it. Every loose filament, every soul the engine had filed as too small to chase, every fraction Kale had shaved and the empire had quietly let him shave because a skimming steward is cheaper than an honest one, all of it I retotaled into one account the standing order had never built a column to hold. An unclaimed credit, a counterparty with a balance, walking on its own legs. The scribe first, then the bonded clerk, then the freed weight that had tried to land on the girl and now had nowhere to land but home. 11 souls in all, the salvage list entire, each clicking into the new ledger like a coin dropped true into a tally box. I read the foot of my own page, and for the first time since I woke in this borrowed and bankrupt body, the sum had moved in my favor. Not by much, by enough. The empire's total, 400 years unflickering, flickered by 7 silver. Smedby sat in a fold of the hills like a coin dropped between floorboards and forgotten, too small for the imperial roll, too poor for a banner, a place the standing order had filed under, salvage, and meant to let starve quietly into a clean, blank line. 40 roofs, maybe 30 still kept the rain out, the thatch gone black and caved where the rafters had surrendered, and one tallow-rendering shed breathing greasy smoke into a sky the color of watered milk. A dog watched me from a doorway and did not bark. Even the dog had been economized. The well rope had frayed to 3 strands, and I counted them. Over the rooftops the script hung thin, almost worn through, but legible to anyone trained to read what a place owes against what it will never earn. The grain was gone before it grew. 3 harvests forward sold to cover a tithe that had doubled the season Kale took the district, the debit rolling forward and compounding while the soil gave back less each spring. The sons were worse. Every boy at his 12th birthday posted to the levy as collateral against the village's arrears, his future labor booked as an asset the empire could call whenever the foot total wanted steadying, daughters logged as dowry receivable. A whole settlement entered as one deferred liability, scheduled to clear itself by ceasing to be. Beneath the 3rd largest house, under a flagstone worn glassy by feet that no longer lived above it, sat Kale's strongbox, the receivable that had pointed homeward, now pointing into a hole in the ground, in the one parish poor enough that no auditor would ride to confirm it. 40 years of skim, buried in the soil he had skimmed it from. I did not dig. Coin was never the instrument, the posting was. The irony filed itself. I lifted the village's whole column out of the master sheet the way I had lifted the 11. Grain, sons, dowries, the deferred extinction line entire. And I did not cancel it, because cancellation is the meal the engine waits for, the struck debt rebuild to the nearest same trade soul before the ink has dried. I reassigned it. Every entry I moved into the unclaimed credit account, the counterparty walking on its own legs, the slot the standing order had never thought to build. The forward-sold grain I matched against Kale's buried recovery, debit to debit, and they closed without a spark. The levy bonds on the boys I transferred whole and marked them held, not owed, held by a creditor who wanted nothing back. The sheet shuddered. I felt it through the soles of borrowed boots, the way you feel a floor settle, a tremor running the length of the foot total, while the order hunted for the nearest soul of the same trade to absorb the loss. It found none. I had not freed one farmer for the next to inherit. I had moved every farmer in the column at a single stroke, the whole trade lifted off the page in one motion, and the engine's groping hand closed on air. A counting house trick had become a thing with 40 roofs and a tallow shed. The bubble could not seek its level because I had carried off the board. Smedby did not cheer. It had forgotten the grammar of it, and I had announced nothing from no dais. The woman at the well drew her bucket, and the 3-strand rope held, doing the work of a whole one. A boy, who should have marched at his next birthday, went on splitting kindling as though the hours ahead were his to spend, because the ledger now agreed they were. The 11 I carried clicked over in their new account. The village fell in beside them, the first holding of a fund that owed the empire nothing and answered to no seal but the foot of my own page. Not subjects, depositors. The order had built itself across 4 centuries to swallow exactly such places, one starved line at a time, and I had just proven the swallow could be run backward, settlement by settlement, column by column, if the days held. I read my page again. I weighed what I had founded against what I had left to spend, and the math, for once, did not read as a sentence handed down. It read as a thing that could grow. The empire's total flickered. Not by 7 silver this time, by a village, by a village, and the number stood corrected for as long as it took the well woman to set her bucket on the lip, no longer. Then the master sheet disagreed with itself, in my favor. It made me pay for the courtesy. The loss it could not route to a same-trade farmer did not vanish. An engine built to reconcile does not swallow a deficit, it relocates one. I watched red climb a column I had thought sealed, my own. The 412,000 had stood a wall 4 centuries thick, twice stamped, fixed, and now it added to itself the way frost adds to a crack. The deferred extinction line I had refused to let clear came back not as Smedby's debt, but as mine, repriced, readdressed, a liability that had merely changed parishes and kept my name on the deed. The codicil's 9 days did not move. The figure beneath them did, climbing. The fund I had built to be a counterparty was being read as one. That was the line I had under-audited. A counterparty walks on its own legs, true, but legs can be served a writ. An account with a balance is an account that can be billed, and the order, denied a farmer, turned to the appendix it had stocked against precisely this hour and began reading my 11, not as deposits, but as instruments. Salvage has a second use. Pledged collateral pays out when the pledger defaults. I had moved the souls. I had not moved the clauses stapled to them. Third from the top stood Sir Roderick. I had reconciled him in good faith, folded him the way I folded the village, lifted his oath whole into the fund, marked it held, not owed, a creditor who wanted nothing back. The engine read the same entry by a different rule. His loyalty was logged in the contract script with a rider I had noted and underweighted, his sword hand pledged in advance against my forfeiture, a man cast to die at a door for nothing he would ever be asked to choose. When my debit crossed the term line 3 breaths ago, the rider matured. The order needed no stranger to enforce the seizure of the prince. It owned a knight already inside the room. He had been cleaning the gelding's near hoof with a folding pick when the change took him. I saw it arrive as a figure, not a feeling. His line inverting on my page, credit to debit. Vassal reclassified to encumbrance in the time it takes ink to wick along a single fiber of vellum. His hand left the hoof. It found the hilt before his eyes had agreed to the journey, the knuckles whitening on leather worn pale by 40 years of grip. The same glassy wear the flagstone had taken from the feet of the dead above Cale's box. He looked at me. The man looked at me. The contract looked through him. "My lord," he said, and the 2 words cost him in coin I could hear, the levy rising in his throat, the solvent part of him fighting the part the empire had quietly repossessed while I was busy founding a faction out of starving thatch. His boots squared, the stance a headsman takes before the swing, weight even, nothing wasted. A posture entered in him long before this morning and only now called payable. I did the only thing my trade permits. I read the page. The freeing I had penned for him stood there in my own hand, and beneath it, in a hand 4 centuries colder, the rider it had triggered. Because the seam I had found cuts both ways, and an engine that reads sums, not intent, will read a rescue as a default the instant a default closes neater. I had proven the swallow could run backward, settlement by settlement, if the days held. The order had simply asked what a faction with a balance is worth when one of its own deposits carries a blade pledged against its founder, and answered in steel. His arm came up, not fast. The reluctance was his, the motion was not his to keep. Somewhere under the watered milk sky, the tallow shed went on breathing greasy smoke, indifferent, while the man I had carried out of the salvage column the way I'd carried the rest, set the edge of his oath toward my neck. A debt I had marked held, restated overnight, and now drawing in the hand I had freed. The edge had not reached me when the missing figure surfaced, and it surfaced the way bad debt always does, too late to act on, precisely on time to indict. I had been closing rows, that was the fault. Not Smedby, not the fund, not the rider I had underweighted by a hair of vellum, the method underneath all of it, mine, audited at last by the man who built it. Each line I struck clean I handed the engine as a closure, and a closure was the single input it could digest. I had been feeding the thing I meant to starve, spoon by spoon. book squared, a blade rising, and beneath both, the page kept its column open like a mouth. Run the campaign back from the top, the way you reconcile a falsified quarter, not by the entries that scream, but by the rhythm under them. Kale's skim, closed, and the deficit moved a parish over. The phantom estate debts, settled, and the order woke a column I'd thought sealed and made it climb. The village lifted whole. 11 souls walked into a fund, every one a stroke I had been proud of for the length of a breath, and every one a same trade hole the script groped to fill, and, finding none, billed home to me. I had not been winning small. I had been compounding interest on my own throat. Every correction a deposit. The engine paid out in steel. The error was structural, and structural errors do not care how fast your hand moves. A self-correcting ledger cannot be defeated downstream. You cannot outpost a posting that exists to absorb your post. I had treated 4 centuries of fraud as a flood and stood in the doorway with a bucket, bailing brilliantly, line after line, while the crack that fed it widened above me with the patience of rot working a roof beam. The roof was not the problem. The roof was the symptom. Somewhere a single source bled, and I had been auditing the puddle. Roderick's arm came down through the cold tallow smoke, slow as a debt that knows it will be paid regardless, and I let the part of me that wanted to flinch stand in for collateral while the rest kept reading. Because the page had a top. I had felt its weight from the first morning, 4 centuries, twice stamped, a wall. But a wall is only a sum, and a sum is only the foot of a column, and a column has a first row. Every fraud I had ever unpicked began with one entry made in good light by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The standing order was no different. It rebills to keep its total whole, which means its total was set once, by hand, by a clerk 400 years colder than the one the empire had stapled into Roderick's oath. Set, and never re-examined, trusted because it was old. That was the seam, not the 1,000 corrections fanning out from it, the originating posting, the seed. And I knew its size before I knew its date, because the engine had told me when it flinched. Its 4 centuries unflickering total had moved, once, under my hand before any of this matured, by 7 silver. Not a round number, not a tithe or a tax or a tally any honest crown would strike. The exact deficit I had chased to my death across a desk in a life filed under closed. The figure that had burned out a reconciliation clerk and posted him, screaming nothing, into a bankrupt prince. The empire's whole weight balanced on a 7 silver lie. And a lie that small is never an accident. It is a plug. Someone forced the books to foot 400 years ago and left 7 silver hanging to make the rest stand. And every soul since, Sieglinde at the head of the salvage column, the boys levy bonded, the daughters marked dowry receivable, the knight whose edge was 3 inches from my collarbone, had been paying down the interest on a single forged row no one had dared to open. I stopped bailing. I let the bucket go. Find the seed entry. Not Roderick's rider, not the climbing 412,000, not the next symptom dressed as a crisis. The first row, the founding fraud, the 7 silver posting that the whole standing order stood up to hide. Close that, and there is nothing downstream left to feed. I had 9 days, a blade falling, and a faction that existed on paper. I needed the page where it all began. We left at the hour the seal keepers count their wax, 2 horses and no banner, and for the first time since the writ, I rode as a private debtor instead of a crown. No herald, no escort billed against an estate that held nothing. Sieglinde took the northern track without asking my leave, and I let her, because the woman the appendix had priced at the head of a salvage column now read a map the way I read a column. Quick, distrustful, refusing the toll road the way I refused a total set once and never reopened. "You're certain it's a place," she said on the second day, not looking down, "and not a date." The rein sat easy in her hands. A posting has a where, the same as a when. Every fraud is committed somewhere. I watched a roe deer break from the alder and thought of the 11 souls walking on their own legs in the fund I had founded. The village turned depositor behind us, the whole faction that existed on one sheet of vellum and my name at its foot. The clerk who set the seed stood on ground. We go to the ground. The road thinned. The villages thinned with it. each smaller than the last, each tithe stone leaning at the same tired angle, until on the fourth morning, the last fence post gave out and the trees changed their bookkeeping. I felt it before I named it. Cold, then wrong. The rowans at the wood's edge stood in full leaf, and 3 yards past them the same species hung bare and gray as a debt no one would own. Bark split along the grain, the way a column splits when you force it to foot. A blight, the locals called it, and they had been calling it that, unpaid for the word, for 400 years. I put my palm to the dead bark, and the page that lives behind my eyes, debit and credit hung over every living thing, opened the way it opens over a falsified quarter. The trees kept books. Every trunk carried 2 columns. Sap drawn, sap returned. Light taken from the season, growth posted against it. A healthy ash balances. What it pulls from the soil, it pays back in leaf and shade and the slow interest of timber. These did not balance. These were overdrawn. Each dead rowan, each hollowed alder, each birch peeled white showed the same entry copied down its length. A withdrawal, ancient, never matched by a deposit. The forest was not cursed. The forest was in arrears. "What do you see?" Sieglinde said. She had stopped looking at the trees and started looking at my face, which is its own kind of audit. A standing charge. I walked deeper, reading trunk after trunk, and the figure repeated on each. Not random rot, not weather, not the wandering sickness of a tired wood, but one missing credit fanned outward from a single source, the way an error copies down a ledger when no one catches the first row. Something was taken from here once and never posted back. The wood has carried the deficit on its own books ever since, spreading it, thinning it across every trunk so no single tree falls, the way the engine thins my 400,000 across a column of farmers. "It rebills," she said, quick. She had traced the founding fraud beside me long enough to finish the thought. Same as the order, to the nearest same trade soul. Tree to tree, root to root. A wren ticked once in the deadwood and went silent. The blight no one can explain is a correction no one can read. It hides the way a clean fraud hides, by spreading thin. We went in on foot and led the horses. The light failed early under the canopy, a brown dusk at midday, and the deeper we walked, the older the dead grew, rowan giving way to oak, oak to something I had no name for, trunks wide as gatehouses and gray to the heart. The arrears compounded inward. Whatever I traced did not weaken toward its source the way a smell weakens from a door. It strengthened. Every fraud points home if you read the direction of the worsening, and the worsening pointed at the center of the wood like a finger laid on a tally. By dusk, I could feel the shape of it. One entry, not 1,000. The whole gray ruin of this forest hung off a single posting that had never been made. A credit owed and withheld at the exact spot where men once drove their first stake and called a kingdom into being. The realm's founding site. The seam I had crossed 4 provinces to open. The trees fell quieter the nearer we came, the way clerks go silent when the auditor reaches the right drawer. Ahead, through the last brown light, something pale stood at the center that all the dead had been planted to surround. Not grown around, buried. We dug it out with our hands, and the pale thing was not stone. It was skin gone to the color of unlit tallow, stretched over a frame that had stopped being wholly a frame, half a man, half the slab he lay against. The boundary between flesh and rock blurred the way ink blurs when a clerk weeps on a wet page. Chains held him, not iron. I put my fingers to the links, and the page behind my eyes lit them for what they were. Ruled lines, columns hammered into manacles, a ledger folded into the shape of a fetter and locked around a living wrist. He breathed, once every long while. "Don't," Sieglinde said, but I was already reading him. His column ran the length of his bound arm, the oldest hand I had ever met. 4 centuries of compounding, posted in a script that predated the one I knew, the founding grammar, the first stroke. I had crossed 4 provinces, certain I would find a fraud. I found the fraudster. No, I found the man they had made into the fraud's machinery, which is not the same thing, which is worse. His ledger told it plain, the way a forged quarter tells on itself once you stop trusting the total and start reading the rows. 400 years back, a contract had been written here, the empire's first, and its author had needed a balance that would never close, a debt the provinces could not pay, and could therefore be billed forever. So he built one. He took this man's soul, priced it at 7 silver, and posted it twice, once as a debit owed by the land, once as a credit owed to the crown. The same sum entered as both wound and wealth. Souls in, crowns out. A misposting deliberate to the decimal, engineered to compound. Each defrauded soul rebilled to the nearest. The engine I had fought all spring unspooling backward to one chained wrist. The seed, Sieglinde whispered. The signatory, I said. I crouched closer. The chains had grown into him. Where a link crossed his skin, the flesh had calcified, posting by posting, the way the dead trees outside had hardened around their unpaid withdrawal. He was the first to sign and the last still paying. They had not buried him to hide a corpse. They had planted him to keep a fund liquid, a counterparty that could not default because it could not die, kept exactly alive enough to be billed, never enough to settle. I had founded a fund of 11 souls the engine could not hold. The empire had founded its own 4 centuries before mine, of one soul it would not release. His eyes opened. Gray, the iris cracked like the bark. You read, he said. The voice came out as dry as a turned page. 400 years, and they only ever wrote. I had no comfort to post. I looked instead at the place where his ledger ran thinnest, a single line near the manacle's edge worn almost through, a charge so old it had nearly rubbed itself blank, and I struck it. Cleared it the way I clear any settled row, one clean debit against the credit beside it, 2 figures canceled to nothing. The chain did not break. The link over that line, though, loosened by the width of a hair, and the man drew a breath that did not take a long while to arrive. The wood outside, I would learn, breathed when he breathed. Again, he said. I cleared a second entry, a third, each one a coin into a hand that had held nothing for 4 centuries, each paid back not in steel, the engine's currency, but in slack, in air, in the smallest unposting of a sentence. Behind me, Sieglinde had already unrolled the vellum that carried my whole faction, Smedby's village, the 11, my name at its foot, and started ruling a fresh column with his name at its head. He watched me work with the wary stillness of a debtor promised relief before, and burned by the promise. Trust would be a slow ledger. I have always understood slow ledgers. Your name, I said. They struck it from the first page. His mouth moved toward something that was not a smile. I kept a copy, though. A pause, dry as chalk. Shenny. I posted the name to no account. I held it. Reading him there, half stone and half ode, I saw the architecture whole at last. The empire was not a realm that kept a contract. It was a contract that had grown a realm around a buried man to keep him paying. Every minted crown and inherited banner and oath sworn at every marble altar tracing down through 400 years of interest to one deliberate misposting. And to the 7 silver it was priced at, the same 7 silver I had chased into my grave and woken still owing. The defection posted itself before the rider crested the ridge. On the vellum, Sieglinde had only just begun to rule. Low in the column of the 11, a name went pale, ink withdrawing from its own loops, a pledge unsigning itself in the cold air. I read it upside down without rising. Garrow, the tanner, 6th to kneel in Smedby's yard, and, I had logged at the time, the last among them to mean the kneeling. Then the hoofbeats, unhurried, the gait of a man who knows the debt rides with him. He did not come himself. He had sent a clerk in imperial gray, and the clerk did not dismount, only read from a strip of waxed linen the length of a tally stick. Garrow of Smedby, tanner, had accepted the crown settlement of his arrears in full, and, for it, surrendered his pledge to the fund and named the wood. Bought. Cheaply. A man will sell a kingdom's hiding place for the price of his own hide, and the books never once mark him a villain. only a counterparty who found a better rate. I felt the relocation before I saw it. The fund had balanced because 11 unclaimed credits leaned against one another, no single soul bearing the whole, the engine unable to seize a sum that sat in no one's name. Pull one stone. The arch does not lose a stone, it loses its arch. Garrow's credit did not vanish when he walked. It came looking for the nearest signatory able to bear it, and the nearest signatory was the man who had ruled the column at its foot. The double entry woke over my own wrist, debit and credit, and the debit moved. I watched it climb the way I had once watched water climb a cellar stair. 410 crowns in a breath. There is a line. I had found it weeks ago and declined to look at it, the way a man declines to read the physician's last sentence aloud. Below a certain margin, a soul stops being a debtor the empire bills and becomes a thing the empire owns. Inventory, posted to the asset side. A body shelved against future billing, exactly as Shenny had been shelved against 4 centuries of it. I had kept slack between myself and that line. A reserve, not coin. I held no coin the engine respected, but the unspent capacity to absorb one more shock without tipping into the asset column. 1,100 crowns of distance, the whole of my treasury, and it was made of nothing but room to fall. I spent it. No other entry was available. I took the relocated charge and met it from reserve, posting my own slack against Garrow's abandoned hole. One clean debit struck on the credit it had orphaned. The cellar water held at the 3rd stair instead of the 4th. Sieglinde watched my hand and understood the arithmetic without being told it, because she had learned to read me the way I read the dead. "How much?" she said. Not a question, a line item. I answered her by turning back to the wall, to the half-stone man whose breath set the wood's breath, and clearing the next worn line at his manacle, because that was the only ledger left where my posting bought something instead of merely paying for something. Each line I honored at his wrist, Shenyi returned a fraction of trust, and trust from the founding signatory was the single asset on the field the engine had no entry to seize. Promised relief once, and burned by the promise 400 years running, he counted my clearings now the way I counted everything, slowly, aloud. 3 today, he rasped, the cracked iris widening. The other ones only ever wrote 3 a year, and called it mercy. So I had 2 ledgers open and 1 currency between them. Spend reserve to stay solvent, and the engine drinks it and asks for more. Spend the same labor on Shenny's chains, and a thread of leverage stays alive. The only thread, fed line by honored line, that ran toward the seed instead of away from it. I would have to ration where every breath went. I chose and kept choosing, and the column over my wrist did not stop climbing while I did. When the imperial clerk had turned his horse and gone, I let myself read the margin I had left. Reserve spent, 1,100 crowns. Reserve remaining beneath it, the figure I had crossed a kingdom to avoid writing, 40. 40 crowns of distance between Prince Aurel, debtor, and Prince Aurel, asset, shelved beside Shenny to keep some later fund liquid, kept alive exactly enough to be billed, never enough to settle. The water stood at the 3rd stair. I had no slack left for the 4th, and somewhere down the column, a 12th name had already begun to pale toward its better rate, 40. For weeks I had kept the wrong books. A defended column is a column already conceded. You shore only what you have agreed to lose. And I had been shoring stone by stone, spending slack to hold water off a stair, while the origin sat untouched at the bottom of a wood. The auditor's oldest rule outranks every vow sworn over cold marble. You do not balance a fraudulent ledger by paying it down. You void the entry that made it false. I had read the empire as a creditor. Wrong column. It was never a creditor at all. Only a misposting 4 centuries deep, and misposting carries a cure that payment never offers. I knelt to Shenny's wrist and traced the founding line once more. 1 soul priced at 7 silver and entered twice. Debit owed by the land, credit owed to the crown. The same wound booked as wealth. The engine fed on that contradiction. It rebuilt because it required a counterparty. Every canceled debt went hunting the nearest same-trade soul. And so long as souls stood apart, separate names, separate threads, the hunt always found a fresh wrist to fix upon. Separation was the fuel. The arch I had built of 11 leaning credits, 10 now, ran the same principle backward. No single bearer, nothing to seize. Consolidate. One entry, all of it. If I assumed every debt in the realm into a single name, mine, and drew every bound soul in with it, Sheni included, the 10 pledged, Smedby's folded tides, the phantom rose, Garrow's orphaned whole, the whole climbing column gathered onto one ledger, then the engine would have exactly one counterparty left to rebill, me. Against that consolidated sum, I would post the closing line I had crossed a kingdom to find. Void the 7 silver double post at its source. Strike the founding misposting clean. Leave the land owing nothing and the crown credited nothing. No fund to keep liquid. Nowhere for the loop to land, because the loop's last wrist would hold a balance of 0. I ran the figures 3 times by the light of Sieglinda's tallow stub, and 3 times they returned identical. To assume every debt is to owe it. The double entry over my wrist would show a debit no credit on the field could meet. My reserve stood at 40 crowns, and the consolidated load was the arrears of 4 centuries. The margin between debtor and asset is not a wall, it is a threshold, and I would cross it the instant the ink dried. Bankrupt outright. Shelved beside Sheni, half calcified into a slab. Build forever. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. 400 years, posted to one wrist. Except the figure lied by omission, the way the founding fraudsters' books had lied. True in every digit, false in their shape. Sheni was kept alive enough to be billed, never enough to settle, because the fraud above him needed a liquid fund, and a fund needs a living counterparty. My posting would settle. Void the origin in the same breath I assume the load, and no fund remains to keep liquid. No later billing waits to shelve a body against. The cost is total. The cost is also final. A bankruptcy that closes the books is a different instrument than one that feeds them, and I had spent an entire first life failing to tell the two apart. I would not post it alone, which was the only reason it could clear. The consolidation needed every thread willing to be drawn into mine. The 10 still pledged, the village that had emptied its tithes into one unclaimed fund, Sieglinda, who could read her own name among the bowed necks and had not yet pulled it free, and Sheni, whose return trust was the single asset the engine had no entry to seize. Without consent, the sum would not gather. It would scatter back into separate wrists, and the hunt would open again. I had built a faction out of arrears. Now I meant to ask it to step into the fire as one name. Sieglinda set the tallow down and read the margin off my face before I spoke it. "You mean to take all of it?" she said, in the flat clerk's cadence she kept for sums already checked. "Onto one ledger, then close the seed." I told her the load would bankrupt the bearer to the last decimal. She did not look from the figure. She had been dyed twice to look poorer than she was offered for, and she knew to the season what the crown priced a life. "A clause," she said. "You're writing yourself a clause." From the slab, Sheni's cracked iris turned toward us, slow as a tide. "Then write it past 3, he rasped. I had the entry whole, and I let myself read it one last time the way I had trained myself to read a death warrant. Aloud, every digit, refusing the mercy of the averted eye. Assume the realm, void the seed, bankrupt the bearer, and call the books closed. The column over my wrist climbed another hair while I decided, and I let it climb, because the cure had named itself the moment I named the disease. You do not pay a fraud down, you void it, and the voiding falls on whoever holds the pen. I held the pen. 40 crowns of distance, and I would spend every one in a single line. 11 days to the seizure, and for the first time in 2 lives, I stood in a room where I was not the only one who could read a column. They came in out of the wet, the 10 still pledged, Smedby at their head with the village's folded tithes wrapped in oilcloth, women with chapped hands, a cooper, a tanner whose apron still carried the reek of the bark pit. I had no banner to give them. I gave them rows. The granary at Holt's Edge became the office. No marble, no livery. I cleared the threshing floor, set the trestles in 3 ranks, and ruled the bare boards into ledgers wide enough to kneel on. To each soul a duty, and to each duty a hand fit to carry it. The cooper had a wheelwright's eye for a true circle and a false one, so I made him reconciler. The tanner counted hides in his sleep, and I set him to tally witnesses. Sieglinde walked the lines with her glove off, pressing 2 fingers to a wrist here, a collarbone there, naming the lien of each thread aloud so the bearer could learn the shape of his own debt. Teach a man to read his foreclosure, and he stops kneeling to it. By the 3rd night, 20 of them could find a misposting in a leaning row. This was the line the engine had never priced. A clerk is cheap, a tallow stub, a sheet of vellum, a hall of clerks it cannot frighten one wrist at a time. I drilled them as I had once drilled myself, cold, repetitive, past exhaustion. We rehearsed the procedure of an imperial seizure until the cooper could recite the writ's clauses backward, where the assessor stood, which wax seal he cracked first, how the script unrolled itself above the proceedings to confirm each line before the crown's claim could attach. I needed them to know the ceremony better than the men who would perform it, because I did not intend to resist the seizure. I intended to host it. The plan was never to bar the assessor at the gate. I meant to walk him through it. An imperial foreclosure carried one flaw written into its own grammar. It had to be witnessed to be valid. The script confirmed nothing in private. A claim attached only where it was read aloud and acknowledged before the bound. And 4 centuries of fastidious self-correction had made that ritual non-negotiable. The engine's pride in its own legitimacy was a door. So I sent a clean letter down Garrow's old route, my seal pressed in green wax, demanding, not pleading, that the seizure be conducted as a public audit. Every line read, every counterparty present, the books opened to the floor. A debtor cannot refuse foreclosure. He can insist it be lawful. I arranged the granary as the founding fraudster had never dared arrange his books, with the script in the dock. Trestles for the bound, ranked by trade. A long table for the assessor, set a hand lower than the floor I would stand on. At the center, where a defendant stands, I left the empty air I meant the leaning script to fill when it unrolled to confirm. A defendant made of its own confirming ink, because the instant it confirmed, it would read its founding entry into a room full of people drilled to hear the theft inside it. Not a defense. An inquest the accused did not yet know it had been summoned to. Smedby asked me, low, whether the crown would simply burn the granary down. A fair line item. I told him the engine could not afford to. A fire is a separation, and every separation it spent against us scattered the very consolidation it needed to bill. It survived by keeping us apart. Gathered, named, ranked on one floor, we became something it had no entry to process. Not 11 liabilities, but 1. Sieglinde walked the chalk to its head and stood where the assessor would have to look up at her, her bare right hand flat on the trestle. She had ridden out priced poorer than she was worth and come back the surety on a closing line, and she read the room as she read a margin. It will send its best clerk, she said, not a soldier. Good, I said. Soldiers I cannot audit. I counted the hall one last time before I pinched the tallow dead. 41 souls who 3 weeks back had owned nothing but their arrears, ranked now, drilled, lettered, waiting on a chalk floor for an empire to walk in and read its own crime aloud. Outside, the imperial road carried a single lantern toward us, one bobbing point in the wet dark, the assessor, a full day early. I had built the courtroom too well to adjourn it. 10 days. Wax split under his thumb. The assessor folding his knees into the table, I had set a hand below the chalk, so that to read the crown's claim, he was forced to look up at a bankrupt, and he did not notice the demotion until his weight had already settled into the slope of it. Bergamot and road rain came off his cloak. He laid out a strong box of seals, 12 of them, each the cost of a different signature, and I logged the inventory before he managed a word. 12 seals. 1 door. Prince Aurel, you requested a public reading. I insisted on a lawful one. Read every line. The script unrolled from the rafters where a barn owl had roosted an hour before, red threads bleeding down into the empty air I had left at the room's heart, and it began to confirm, line, counterparty, balance, in the flat cadence of a thing never once read back to itself. I had counted on that exact deafness. 4 centuries of confirming in private had left it no manners for a crowd. Now. I called my floor. The Cooper stood first. On the beat, Sieglinde tapped against the trestle with 2 bare fingers and recited the lien of his own debt the way we had drilled it, not begging remission, but pledging the whole row onto a single name. Mine. The script confirmed it because the clause was its own. A debt may be assumed by a consenting party. The tanner followed, then the pair from Smedby's folded tithes, each transferring his arrears up the chalk into the central column, each forcing the engine to repost the balance where the new counterparty stood. Every confirmation slid a number toward me. I watched my row climb and held still. Here lay the trap folded inside the trap. The engine could not bill a debt twice without voiding the prior post. Except it had been built to do precisely that 400 years back, when it double-posted Shenny at 7 silver to keep a fund liquid. Its founding act was an overpost. I fed it the same shape at scale. Sieglinde walked the line and named each lien a half-breath before its bearer spoke, so the script confirmed a balance the room had already heard, twice, once from her mouth, once from its ink. And a sum acknowledged before 2 witnesses attaches whether the books can carry it or not. Garrow's orphaned whole, she said, flat as a struck rule. The man who had carried it pledged it up. Confirmed. The phantom rose. Confirmed. The threads thickened where they crossed, the engine posting and reposting the same arrears because every soul on the floor was now one counterparty, and it could no longer tell our debts apart well enough to net them against each other. The assessor saw it before his own ledger did. His hand stalled over the 9th seal. These entries duplicate. The ledger cannot. The ledger is confirming, I said. Take it up with your founder. It could not stop. A self-correcting book, shown a discrepancy, corrects. And each correction was another post, another line read aloud onto the one name I had gathered them under, the column climbing past the tithes, past the 10 still pledged, past Garrow's 410, the red threads knotting over my wrist until the air hummed there like a plucked gut string. My breath shortened. I logged that too. Collateral. Shenny's row I had cleared, not broken, paid in returned slack and trust. The single asset the engine cannot seize, so when it reached down to the bottom of the column for something to balance the overpost, it found no give, nothing to take. It reached higher. It reached for me. My own line crossed from black into red while I stood and let it cross. 40 crowns of reserve, gone in 3 breaths, then 40 in arrears, then 400, then a figure I had run 3 times by Sieglinde's tallow stub and new to the silver. 4 centuries of consolidated debt set against 40 crowns of crown, the whole climbing column folded down onto one bankrupt wrist. The script shuddered over the empty air and began, at last, to read the only entry it had never confirmed aloud, its founding line. The 7 silver double post, spoken into a room of 41 drilled ears that had been taught exactly what theft sounds like when it is read slowly. My wrist went white to the bone. The hum became a weight, then a pull. Every thread in the hall now ran to the same place and dragged, and the engine, to reconcile, posted the last balance it owned, foreclosure, against the name that held all the others. Mine. Read aloud. Witnessed. Attaching. 2 clocks struck 0 on the same breath. The script posted foreclosure against my name in its flat confirming cadence, and underneath that posting a second instrument woke, the collateral appendix, 11 souls deep, pledged centuries back against precisely this forfeiture. I forfeit, therefore the security falls due. Feudal ink does not bargain with conjuration, it only arrives at the same instant and crowds the doorway. Roderick stood at that doorway. He had held it the whole reading, third from the top of a page I had drilled no one to read, because I kept that page folded against my chest. His sword hand was the lien, his oath the guarantee. A foreclosure attaching to a principal calls the guarantor at once, the way a defaulted bond reaches past the debtor for whoever co-signed in the dark, and the engine, finding no give at Shenny's cleared row and no fund at my wrist, turned to the only collateral still warm. A body at a door, pledged in advance. I had modeled every clause but their collision in time. The void needed one more breath. Shenny's 7 silver struck, while the whole column still hung knotted onto my single name, and the appendix wanted its blade this second. No slack between the two. The metaphysical deadline and the feudal one had run on separate calendars for 400 years, and I had dragged them into one room and forced them to meet. Sieglinda's 2 fingers stopped against the trestle. She had felt the beat go wrong. Her eyes came up across the empty air where the threads dragged, asking the only question that mattered, hold or post, and a stall would scatter the consolidation back into 11 separate wrists and reopen the hunt on every one. To save a single name, I would lose 40. The arithmetic did not flatter me. It never had. Hold the line, I said, not to her, to the floor. Roderick turned his head a quarter, enough to show the scar above his jaw, and I understood he had read his own page after all, had counted himself third from the top long before tonight, and said nothing, the way a man tests the depth of a grave he means to dig. The engine reached through me to him. The clause demanded a sword hand cast against a threshold for a forfeiture he had never been asked to choose, and somewhere in the cold accounting of this, I had sworn I would not spend him blind. So I asked, 3 words, no more. Will you stand? He set his boots. That was the whole answer. Heel and instep squared to the door, a posture no granary drill had taught him. And the appendix confirmed him as enforcement, repricing a reconciled ally from asset to settlement in the time ink takes to dry. The threads that had run to my wrist forked and ran to his. His gauntlet rang once against the jam. Then the engine drew on what it had been promised. His line in my ledger flickered from black to a color I have no word for, and the weight crushing my wrist eased by exactly his measure. I logged it. I did not look away. A man does not honor a debt by flinching from its figure, and the figure was a knight I had taught to read his own foreclosure, now spending himself to keep the reading open one breath longer. The granary held its silence. 40 drilled mouths who knew the sound of theft learned a second sound beneath it, lower, and I refused to name that sound for them, because naming it would have stopped my hand, and my hand had a void to strike. The script confirmed him. Counterparty, balance. Closed. I felt the column steady on my name with his weight gone out from under it. The room bought one more breath at the price of the only blade I had ever fully trusted, and Sieglinda's fingers found the beat again, though they shook against the wood. Shenny's row still waited, 7 silver, twice posted, the founding lie hanging unstruck over an empty floor. Roderick did not fall. He simply ceased to be an entry any book could appeal. Standing yet at the door, boots squared, a guarantor seized and settled, present as a man and absent as an asset. And when I looked for his line to confirm what I already knew, the place where it should have run was blank, one name short. The engine had spent itself to the floor of its own vault, and I read the overdraft in the way the red threads thinned to hair. 4 centuries of self-correction, drawn out past the point where any further reaching cost more than it collected. It had emptied the appendix down to a knight at a door. It had climbed every wrist in the room and arrived at the one row it was built around. Stretched, visible, a thing that had only ever worked in the dark, hung unrolled across a granary lit by 40 tallow stubs, and the smoke stood in flat gray sheets where the threads cut it. I had wanted witnesses for exactly this minute, 41 of them, drilled to the sound of theft, mouths shut, eyes up at the empty air where the script leaned to confirm itself a defendant. The seizure was lawful now because it had been seen. No private erasure, no quiet rebill in some book no widow could read. The founding entry hung in open court and read aloud in the script's own confirming ink. That left one line. Shenny's row. 7 silver, posted twice 400 years back to keep a dead fund liquid. The originating lie, the whole apparatus was laid over the way a city paves a marsh and forgets the water beneath. I had cleared their worn rows already, paid them in slack and returned trust, the one coin the engine had no column to seize. What I had not done was strike the double post itself, because to strike it, I needed the thing knotted onto a single name, overextended, unable to scatter, and it had taken Roderick's weight going out from under the column to leave me here with chalk dust on my cuff and the stylus already warm. One posting, either direction. Strike the second 7 silver entry while the consolidation held, and the founding deficit voided to 0, and the column running 41 settled wrists up onto mine would have no debt beneath it to stand on, the whole stacked obligation falling through a floor that no longer existed, every name freed in the same breath. Or miss it. Let the void land a hair wide of the knot, and the engine would find its footing, read me as the last collateral it had reached for since a clerk died over 7 silver and woke in a foreclosed prince's body. Final asset. Repriced and settled the way the night had been, except no one stood third from the top of my page to catch the call. I had always been the security. I understood that now with the clean distaste of a man finding his own name forged on a bond. The double entry had not granted me sight as mercy. It had carried me to this granary the way a creditor carries collateral to auction, to be present when it sells. It meant me to fill the empty air at the defendant's center. It had drilled this room expecting to read its theft over my body. Fine, I had drilled the room too. Sieglinda's fingers held the bead against the trestle, 2 pads white with pressure, and she did not look at the threads. She looked at me. In the flat cadence she kept for sums already checked, she gave me the only figure left. On the next strike. Not a question. She had read the counter-entry off my face a week gone, and never once flinched from where it ended. I set my hand to the line. No tremor. I would have logged a tremor. The vellum was not vellum. It was the air itself gone stiff where the founding entry hung, and it took the stylus the way river ice takes a blade, with a resistance close to a voice. 7 silver. I felt the doubled posting beneath my hand like 2 coins stamped from one die, warm and wrong. The misposting the Empire had called law so long it had forgotten the slip of the pen that made it. My pulse counted itself against the shaft. 41 mouths held their air, the smoke sheets did not stir, and below the chalk, Shenyi's chains lay slack in the dark where I had cleared them but could not break them. To strike was to wager the realm on whether I had the 2 calendars aligned to the half-second. To wait was to be sold. Plain choice. I had never in 2 lives left a deficit unreconciled, not the 7 that killed me, not the 400 years that ran on after. The stylus bit. The line began to part beneath my hand, the first 7 silver entry splitting from the second with a sound like a wax seal cracking, and the engine, exposed, overextended, 1 breath from foreclosing on the only collateral it had ever truly wanted, felt the cut, and turned all its remaining weight toward my wrist. The break finished itself, a sound like a wax seal giving, then nothing, and into that nothing, where 400 years of paving had hidden 1 slipped pen, the engine found no floor beneath its feet, and so it did the only thing a ledger can do when a foundation voids. It climbed toward the nearest balance. That balance was me. Not fire, arithmetic. Some flinching part of me, the part still dying over 7 silver in a counting house 2 lives back, had braced for ruin to arrive as a blade or a heat, or the marble splitting under the trestle. What came instead was the cold competence of a posting machine locating its 1 surviving counterparty and resolving toward him. The 41 settled wrists, every debt the floor had pledged up the chalk inside the hour, drilled and mute and watching, came off the voided foundation in a single motion. They did not fall. There was no down. They folded inward along the lines I had drawn, sideways, home, onto the single name built this week to receive them. Mine. All of it, at once. I had modeled the load. I had written the figure on a granary board in my own hand 3 nights running until Sieglinda stopped checking it. Knowing a number and carrying it are different entries. The column came onto my wrist the way a vault floods when the last brick is pulled. Not a stream, but the whole standing volume. Every cancelled oath and rebuild widow and 40-year skim and pledged century the empire had ever failed to reconcile, summed and posted to one account in the span of a held breath. 412,000 crowns. Plus the souls. The souls had no price column, so the engine improvised one against my pulse. My knees found the chalk without my consent. The tallow stubs guttered all at once, 40 of them bowing their flames flat toward me as if the air itself were being drawn into the account, and the gray smoke sheets that had hung knife straight all evening tore and rushed inward along the threads. I watched my own wrist go the color of rendered fat. I logged it. White at the knuckle, blue beneath, the stylus still warm in a grip that had stopped reporting to me. A man auditing his own seizure does not get to set down the stylus. I kept the column. 41 above, 4 centuries below. The realm balanced on one bankrupt arm. I understood, in the clean way you understand a forgery once you have seen the true signature beside it, that this was the figure the engine had wanted from the first turn of its first page. Not payment, never payment, but a sole obliger overextended past scattering, a last wrist holding everything so it could read its founding theft aloud and call the asset settled. It had carried me here as collateral to auction. It meant to sell me now. The double entry opened both its columns over my body, debit and credit, and leaned to confirm, and found no floor under itself either, because the 7 silver lie was struck. I had cut it in the same breath I assumed the load, not before, not after, in it, so that as the whole stacked obligation came down onto my one name searching for ground to stand on, the ground it reached for was the founding double post, and the founding double post was a clean break, parting like counterfeit prized off true coin. The column ran 41 souls and 400 years and 412,000 crowns down through me toward a foundation that, at the instant of its arrival, voided to zero. A debt is only a debt while something beneath it bears weight. I had removed the marsh from under the city and left the city in the air. Nowhere to net, nowhere to rebuild, nowhere to fall. The engine hung. I felt it hang. The precise stalled hush of a balance that has been struck and not yet either settled or refused, the held quarter-second between the coin leaving the hand and the scale knowing it. Every face in the granary held its air with me. Sieglinda's 2 pads stayed white on the trestle, her count suspended mid-beat. Smoke did not move. The chalk did not move. Roderick's emptied place, third from the top of a page that no longer had a top, did not move. In that suspension, the whole apparatus rested on one consolidated counterparty, whose last wrist now held a balance climbing toward zero from both directions at once, the load pressing down, the founding theft draining up, the 2 calendars I had dragged into one room finally meeting at the half-second, the metaphysical deadline and the feudal one, closing on the same point of my pulse. The scale did not yet know which way it tipped, neither did I. I held the column on a white wrist in a granary lit by 40 drowning flames, and counted the breath, and did not look away from the sum. For 400 years the engine had only ever been owed. I posted to it, 1 line, 7 silver debit, 7 silver credit, the same coin written twice across a founding page to dress an empty fund in the close of a full one. And in the hollow between the 2 figures, a man, sold into his own arithmetic to keep the column liquid. Every rebill since had compounded off that phantom principle, 4 centuries of interest accruing on a sum that was never there. I had dragged the whole realm down onto that single row on purpose. Now I drew the stylus through it, not the load, the lie beneath the load. A true cancellation makes no sound. People expect thunder from the breaking of a curse. A crack, a wail, banners coming off their poles, and what arrives instead is the particular silence of 2 columns that have finally stopped disagreeing. The red threads of ink that had hung knife straight in the granary air all evening, every cancelled oath and rebuild widow strung taut between debit and credit, went slack, drained of tension. They did not snap. A thread that is owed nothing has nothing to hold it up. And so it falls. They fell. Across the chalk, across the kneeling rows, across my white wrist, 400 years of red came down like the first soft ash after a rick fire. And where each strand met the floor, it stopped being ink and became nothing at all. The script turned its pages backward. I watched it unwrite. The foreclosure it had read aloud over my body, the founding theft recited in the flat voice of its own bookkeeping, reversed clause by clause, every entry ever sourced from the 7 silver fraud unwinding toward a row that no longer existed to source it. A ledger cannot stand on a voided foundation any more than a debt can. It had reached for ground beneath me and found none. Now it reached for ground beneath itself and found the same. The 4-century engine, overdrawn, stretched, visible, spent to the floor of its own vault, met the one figure it could not rebill, renet, or carry forward. 0. The load came off my wrist the way water leaves a hull when the breach opens below the waterline, and the sea decides at last that it is done. Not poured, withdrawn. 412,000 crowns unsummed themselves from my pulse. The improvised price the engine had struck against the unpriced souls dissolved first, having never owned a column to live in. My knuckle went from rendered fat back to the ordinary color of a knuckle. The stylus reported to my hand again. I kept hold of it. A man who has carried a column through its worst hour does not flinch when the figure clears. The 40 tallow stubs that had bowed their flames flat toward me stood their fires upright again, one after another down the trestle, as if the air had stopped being drawn into any account. Upright, all 40. Gray smoke climbed now instead of rushing inward. The granary smelled of wet chalk and cooling iron, and beneath that, the wood rot of a thing 4 centuries buried and opened at last to the air. Down the chalk, the chains. I felt the 11 before I saw them, the pledged wrists I had drilled and consolidated and hauled up the chalk inside an hour. 11 souls, and Smedby besides, each unfolding back out of the single name into a separate person. The fund I had built this week dissolving the instant its purpose was footed. A cooper, a widow, a debtor smith. The hunt that had chased them across 11 trades closed with them. No nearest same trade soul left to rebill, no appendix to wake, no guarantor to settle. The seizure had nothing further to seize. Because the thing it had been built around, one buried seed, posted twice, priced at 7 silver, was no longer a debt at all. Cheney stood, up out of the cleared row, slow, the way he did everything, the first signatory unbending from 4 centuries folded into a granary floor, the dirt of the cursed wood still packed in the creases of him. His chain, the curse root chain, the one I had paid in slack and return trust and could not break with any force I owned, did not break now either. It opened. The iron parted at a link that had never been a link, only the rendered shape of an unpaid 7 silver. And 7 silver paid is not iron. The chain dropped open across the chalk and lay there, just metal, cooling. Across the trestle, Sieglinda's 2 white pads moved again. Her count, suspended mid-beat, found its next number. He counted too. 41, Cheney rasped, slow, aloud, the way I count everything. Then lower, in the old wonder of a man who has watched a very long time. The other ones only ever wrote 3. The void had its breath. I gave the last column its footing and ruled the line under it, the way you close a book that finally balances. 7 silver, closed. No herald named the hour. The granary held the silence of a counting house after its last column foots, which is not triumph, but the simple cessation of new entries, the quiet of a page with nowhere left to go. My hand was mine again. I turned it over in the tallow light and read the back of it the way I had read the column all night. Knuckle, vein, the small white scar above the wrist where a stylus once slipped. Ordinary stock, nothing owed against it. The rows were still kneeling. No one had revoked the posture. and an oath does not lift off a spine merely because the creditor has dissolved. Somebody has to strike the line, so I struck it. "Stand," I said, "to the floor, the way I say everything that costs me." And when the floor gave no answer, I went to names instead. The cooper, the widow with the rebuild husband, the debtor Smith whose arrears I had hauled up the chalk inside an hour. Each name, spoken, pried a body off the chalk the way a voided claim releases the soul it was written across. And one after another they came up not as collateral, but as people who happened to be in a granary at midnight. 11 of them, Smedby besides. They did not know what to do with their hands. I recognized the affliction. A man who has been an entry for 40 years forgets he was ever a creditor of his own minutes, and they stood flexing fingers that no longer reported to a ledger, staring at wrists where the red had hung. Bare wrists. At the door, the weight that had lifted off the column when the appendix settled him came back down into Roderick. The guarantor unsettled, the collateral entry reversed along with everything else the fraud had sourced, and he dragged in air like a man surfacing, palm flat to the jam, alive in the plain, stupid way the living are. I logged him restored and did not look away from the figure. He owed me nothing. I had asked once, 3 words, "Will you stand?" The question was closed too. Sieglinde had not yet pulled her name free. I knew it the way I know everything about her ledger. She had walked these lines bare-handed, 2 fingers to each wrist, and somewhere in that walking, she had left her own name threaded into the consolidation, unwilling to footnote herself out while the rest still hung. Her 2 white pads lay open on the trestle now, the count footed, the last number found. She lifted them. She drew her name out of the dead column with the unhurried care of a clerk reclaiming a misfiled deed, and when it came free, she did not slot it back into the role she had played all evening, betrothed, ornament, the clause in a marriage contract that made me solvent on paper. "There," she said, not to me, to the page. "Now I'm only the woman who can count." The double entry opened over my own body last, because the engine always audits the auditor at the end. Debit and credit unrolled across me in the air. Every regulation the Crown had posted against the name Aurel, every inherited arrear, every clause of birth and rank, the 412,000 crowns I had carried for the length of one breath. The credit column answered each. Line by line they canceled, the way 2 equal entries annihilate and leave the margin clean. And where the foreclosure had meant to write deceased, it found no balance to support the word and could not write it. I read down to the foot of myself. Owed, nothing. Owing, nothing. Claimed by Crown, by curse, by the burnt-out clerk I had been, nothing. The deficit that had chased me across 2 lives, 7 silver and 4 centuries of interest, came to rest at the only figure it had ever been trying to reach. 0. Not death. I had expected death. I had priced it, set it against the 40 I would lose to a stall, and chosen the column over my own line without flattering myself that the arithmetic was mercy. The engine ran out of floor, and so did I. And what remains when a self-correcting ledger corrects itself out of existence is not a corpse. It is a free agent. Above the rotted rafters, a principality that had been collateral since before any of us were entered, belonged now to no creditor at all. Not the Crown that misposted it, not the engine that had carried it on one founding lie. Freed. The same way we were freed, by being worth, of a sudden, exactly what we were, and not 1 entry more. I stood among 11 unbound souls, a restored guarantor, a woman who had just renamed her own trade, and none of us answered to anything but the next page, which was blank, which we would have to rule and fill ourselves. Cheney said 41 again, softer, counting us into some tally only he could read. I picked the stylus up off the trestle. New ledger, first line. The candle had burned down to a collar of tallow around its own wick, and the flame stood straight in the dead air of the granary, throwing my shadow long across grain dust that no one would sweep before morning. I set the stylus to the first ruled line. The page took the ink. A sheet of vellum is only a field of nothing until someone agrees to be bound by what is written across it, and I had spent 2 lives learning the weight of that agreement from underneath, pinned by it. Now I held the other end of the instrument. Strange tool, a pen. Lighter than I had ever priced it. I wrote, "No debts." For the length of 2 careers, I had been a man who subtracted, who hunted the figure gone missing and named the wrist it had been lifted from, and the habit reached for its old office out of pure muscle. Find the deficit, post the loss, close the line. There was none to post. So I added. 11 names down the left margin, Smedby's beneath them, Roderick at the door, Shenny, who had once been priced at 7 silver and was now priced at a man, and the column ran not toward what each owed, but toward what the lot of us could raise between us with no creditor leaning over the sum. A muster roll, not a register of arrears. Sieglinde came and stood at my shoulder, her 2 white pads tucked under one arm, and read the line upside down, the way a good clerk reads anything that matters faster than its author can set it down. "You've ruled it wrong," she said. She laid a fingernail against the margin where I had drawn the single vertical that divides what is owed from what is owing on every page made since pages were made. "We don't need that one." She was right. I struck the rule through, 1 clean stroke across the bar that had organized every sheet I had ever touched in either life, and the field went open. 2 columns collapsed into one, a record that held only what was actually present in the room. The broken door let in the smell of wet ash. We had a granary, a count of 41, and no master over any of it. What we held, taught honestly, made us poor and unrepeatable in the same breath. A cooper who could raise a watertight barrel from staves. A widow who carried the debts of 3 villages in her head with no book to lose. The smith. Smedby, who could keep a clean column under any pressure the crown could bring. Shenny, 4 centuries of watching one engine work, every trick of it filed behind his quiet face. The foreclosure had voided the coin, the rank, the very land claims, and left the one stock no ledger can seize, which is what a person knows how to do with their hands. Seed capital of a strange kind. We would rebuild the realm out of skills and start the prices over. Here is the figure I'd been least honest about, the entry I'd carried unposted across both my deaths. I had wanted this. Not the dying. I had priced the dying and paid it without once flinching from the number, but the after, the swept field, the morning a man wakes to find no claim filed against his hours. I had run the audit on every soul in this room, and never the once on the want beneath my own work. Owed, nothing. Owing, nothing. A free agent does not so much discover his freedom as read, late and plainly, the desire that had been driving the pen all along. I had won it off the page. To get there, I had taken a whole principality with me. The door of the granary was the last door of the counting house I had been born into. The crown's house, the engine's house, the house that filed men as figures and called the filing order. And I walked toward it across chalk, still smoking faintly, where a 4-century correction had corrected itself clean out of the world. Behind me, the 11 were learning their hands again. Roderick held the jam. Sieglinde footed her pads. I did not turn to read the figure at my back. There was no figure left to read. The hinge shrieked, rust grinding rust. A sound very like a final line being struck through. Outside, the wood that had hidden Shenyi for 400 years dripped toward dawn, and a single rook went up off a black branch with a clatter, graceless and loud, owing the gray morning nothing at all. The sky above the rotted eaves had gone the color of a washed slate before the first sun of the day. Cold, clean. I stood on ground that answered to no creditor, in a body bound by no clause, holding a ledger ruled in one honest column for a company of 41 who would have to invent the country they now owned, line by line. And I noticed, without alarm, that I had stopped counting the days I had left. The deficit was closed. I went to open something.